So yeah, welcome everybody to this exciting moment when we, for the first time, along with this lecture series, have real guests in real time, in real space here, TACK Ross and Christoph Grafe, who I will introduce you soon. So welcome, but of course also everybody who will follow us via YouTube. Unfortunately, we cannot see you at the same time, but I know you are there. So welcome everybody to the third part of this lecture series, which whose title is the title of a huge European research project, Communities of Tacit Knowledge, Architecture and its ways of knowing. This research project consists of 10 academic partners, 10 European universities, and also what is called non-academic partners, which means that cultural institutes and also architecture offices are involved in this program. And the most important part of the program are 10 PhD students who will prepare and hopefully also finalize their PhD in about 1.5 years, something like that. So the program is running since beginning 2020, unfortunately, almost exactly also with the beginning of the pandemic situation. So we had the unfortunate situation that even though it was planned that the partners of this huge network will meet each other, let's say almost 2 or 3 times a year, we only met mostly completely online, which is at the end, I have to say that this is not really a benefit for such a huge research project. It's much more. So I just can advise everybody to try to organize a personal meeting, but this is another topic. I just wanted to mention this, that this is a real problem. I have to admit. So this time, Tacit Knowledge will touch on another side of tacit knowledge, namely on tacit assumptions that are embedded in our common codes, values, normative habits, which are huge. One of the standard narratives, of course, in architecture is the story of the male Western singular creator of architectural ideas and projects, of so to say, the author. The topic of the authorship has been addressed already since decades in the European discourse, not only in architecture, but in the arts, in science, and so on. But it has been refreshed throughout the last years, or also maybe almost decades, in particular by recent debates on feminist or decolonial studies, also in architecture. Some of these debates are much older, but in architecture sometimes it's a little bit slow to involve or incorporate these kind of debates. So today we are going to address the concept of authorship in the framework of tacit knowledge, and I'm extremely happy to have invite you to introduce you our 2 guests from London and Wuppertal. The first lecture will be by TACK Ross from London. TACK is professor for architecture and philosophy, and also director of the MA Architecture History at the Bartlett School of Architecture, UCL. And her main topic, or her research, is mainly on what she calls relational architectural ecologies, which means she addresses topics of human and non-human life in architecture, the planetary dimension, and also the housing ecologies, where she also incorporates, for example, feminist theories into architecture. She's the author of Space, Geometry and Aesthetics Through Kant and Towards Deleuze, which appeared in 2008. To me, it's very important because that someone goes through the history of geometry and its role for architecture also in the context of this subjective, figure-oriented discourses. And another publication which came out 1 year before, Irigaray for architects, and also some anthologies like Architectural Relational Ecologies, Architecture, Nature and Subjectivity came out in 2013, and Poetic Biopolitics, Practices of Relation in Architecture and the Arts in 2016. So she publishes alongside with artistic, environmental, human rights, social and medical research. So she has a very broad approach and a very interdisciplinary concept. Her recent publications include Reputations Donna Haraway, appeared in the Architectural Review just 1 month ago, and Conversation with Design Earth, Reimagining Museums for Climate Action came out last year. Then, for example, Visualizing Uncertainty and Vulnerability in Materia Architectura Journal. I think I tend to pronounce it in Italian. It's Spain actually. And non-human architecture ecologies, is there an object-oriented architecture in 2020? And of course, many more. There's a number of articles and essays by PACK. And since she is professor for architecture and philosophy, the first lecture by her will be also set up the philosophical tone, so to say, that philosophical setting. And then I already take the opportunity to introduce also Christoph to you. And Christoph will address he's an architect, and he worked for, I don't know how many years but he worked as an architect in practice, and after a while, also 5 years. Okay, 5 years. And then he also became an editor for Oase. This is a journal, an architectural journal, a theoretical journal based in Delft. And it's a quite important and also influential magazine. And actually, in your self-description, you also suggest that this was the moment when you started also to become more a theoretician than, and not only a practitioner anymore. Is that correct?
No, I would say that.
Okay.
I said that while I was in practice,
you were, okay.
keep a distance to what I was doing.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Or during the day and the night, but you know.
Okay, okay.
So it was really about that process of distancing. I should say that with the last conceive ourselves during the theory.
Mm-hmm.
We actually think of the journals as something that is really, we would say by neither nor.
Okay, okay, okay. Yeah. But also allows theoreticians like me to publish there. Okay, yeah. Anyway. Yeah. I didn't know that before. Okay. But finally, you became also a director of the Vlaams Architectuur Institute in Antwerp. And now you are professor for architectural history and theory at the University of Wuppertal, so the Bergische Universität Wuppertal. And publications, of course, by Christoph, I want to mention as well. For example, People's Palaces, Architecture, Culture, and Democracy in Post-War Western Europe. And very recently, I think very recently published Umbau, Kultur and Architecture of Altering, together with Tim Rienitz. He's also still a member of the editorial board of Oase, and also co-editor and co-publisher together with Franziska Bollerei of Eselsohren. And as I know, Christoph speaks English, German, Italian, Swedish, Dutch, and French, probably. Did I forget anything? But actually, he can answer in many languages. Low German, okay, okay. So thank you very much for you both to take the risk to come personally in this very dangerous and risky times. And I'm looking forward to your lectures. As always, the lectures will take about 20 minutes plus minus. And then later on, we turn over to the discussion, to the dialogue. And you as the audience here in the lecture hall, but of course, everybody who is listening to us on YouTube, you are welcome to contribute to this discussion afterwards. We are looking forward to your question. Thank you very much.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much, Angelica and colleagues. It's really lovely to be here. It is my first trip out of the UK for some time, so it's, super. I'm going to be speaking for about 20 minutes, and the title is Living with Relational Tacit Practices. So I'm going to press, here we go. So I'm going to begin with just a short set of comments about tacit knowledge. Some people in the audience here and online may be following this quite closely. And certainly if you have, then the work in Polanyi is taken as a really important aspect of this history and of these concepts. Polanyi recognizing that knowledge exceeds representation and the need to discuss the felt, embodied, temporal, sensorial experience. Knowledge therefore speaks more than bounded representations, objects, or forms. Collins has then taken this to talk about the community, the relationship between collectives and different individuals in the forms of enunciation. So enunciation is not just about the object, it's about the process of production. In architectural research and pedagogy and in professional practice, there are many ways in which these kinds of operations take place. Some of them really are about inclusion, but many, as we are discussing and as Angelica hinted, can also be about exclusions. So while they're productive, whilst this is a profession that engages in cultural, economic powers, these are also political, and they're also often embedded in questions of property and of ownership. So today I want to move to discussions from those to ones which are more about notions of living with as a kind of critical form of tacit knowledge, one which might actually produce possibly some questions for those who are studying it, but ones that I think are really acutely relevant for architectural authorship today, and of architecture's relationship to the arts, the humanities, sciences, and for society at large. And this is the suggestion that living with, as a form of tacit knowledge, is a relational practice. It's one that asks us to engage in ethical, critical, political, and also, I'd argue, planetary concerns. It's one that needs to engage with the relationships and what Angelica suggested, more than human questions, ideas that may be both architectural, may be about subjects and individuals, but may also need to be about environments and other questions of social relations. And so this is a time when obviously all of us are acutely aware of being located within these very complex and political and conflicted social and economic times. But I would also argue that these are conversations that we can address through artful, ethical, and compassionate means. And these are practices and communities and knowledges that we are engaged with. And I think many people are seriously, obviously, thinking about how they position and develop their own work with this. So the slide here is one which shows our house on fire. There are 3 houses on fire here. One is Grenfell Tower, the London social housing tower block from 2017. There's the Australian fires, 2019, 2020. And then obviously today there is the Kharkiv and the Ukrainian fires. These are all parts of how we live today, the pandemic, the climatic, planetary, questions of inequality, of inclusion and exclusion, and of governmental and conflict crisis. I have them here because in terms of speaking today, I've been reminded of the Grenfell Tower experience when I was asked by a colleague to read a book of his, which contained Giorgio Agamben's notion of art and architecture and society in the image of a house on fire. Agamben says, quote, "It is only in the burning house that the fundamental architectural problem becomes visible for the first time. Art at the furthest point of its destiny makes visible its original project," close quote. And the reason I was reminded of this is because at the time I read these words and they vibrated and blurred as I was looking at images and listening to news and watching online long days, very much immersed in the reports of that experience, which befell that community and the physical distress that it produced. Now, 5 years on, that community's distress is still ongoing, and questions about the neglect of equitable, safe residential life, security, are still being brought out in witness statements, which are exposing corporate malpractice, building technologies, failing in the regulation, engineering, manufacturing, but also in architectural responsibility. And at the time, the much repeated phrase was used, duty of care, which really, rather than pointing to the idea of address, actually showed the issues of systemic decline in housing welfare in British society from the last 40 years. But it also then struck a chord repeatedly in the years since then. The questions of the climate emergency, the experience of the pandemic, which we're still in, the social inequalities and the questions of Black Lives Matter, which raised huge questions and concerns across the globe. And now, of course, obviously the invasion of Ukraine. So these are examples of the tensions between powers and knowledges and showing that these are innately connected. But 300 years before Polanyi and conversations of the Tacit, which some of us are engaged in at the moment, Baruch Spinoza's 17th century philosophy of life and the ethics also argued for the need for humane reasoning about knowledge that wasn't confined just to intellectual powers of rational thinking. Instead, Spinoza argued that the power of reasoning is intimately connected to corporeal and societal bodies and senses, situated in human experience and expression. He argued for corporeal powers that construct nature, minds, and bodies as societal and individual agencies, sites through which we construct personal and community welfares and care of the self. Angelika has talked about the work and the position from which I contribute to the architectural discussions about authorship. And these come from questions that raised by feminist, political, and materialist philosophies, which have critiqued scientific discussions of art and society and architecture for their exclusion of material differences of lived experience. Instead, this kind of practice, which is multiple and involves many, many different kinds of collaborative authors, affirms practices of the world and its matters, buildings, bodies, ecologies. And these are constituted through specific material relations rather than disembodied scientific reasons. These practices argue that reasoning should be understood as always embodied and located in specific times, histories, spaces, and places, and undertaken by specific people, communities, and individuals. And core to these projects is the need to question normative and universal understandings of humanism that in fact constrain and restrict people and isolate them. They're also interested in inserting human difference back into materialist questions of matter, notions of matrix, matrixiality, of economy and oikos. And finally, within the more environmental climatic questions that many people may now be turning to examine the relationship between the human and the non-human, and how between us, responsible ethical interactions may produce more respectful and generous ideas of our resources and of our communities, and engage and resist some of the very problematic and extensive problems of extraction, of reuse, and of depletion. And my work contributes to these, as Angelica said, through these two projects in particular, which at the time were very much understood as relational. I just want to highlight that I think now my work and many people involved in this will also want to talk about intersectional thinking, the need to recognize these very constitutive differences, very actively, also rethinking and reconfiguring us as we do our work. These are two projects which engage with the social sciences, with the arts, and with the performative and with the architectural, very intentionally. And they're seen as processual practices, not as codes of behavior that produce axioms that then never change. And often these questions are more about ontology, more about ways of being than the notion of engaging purely with the products or the epistemes or the forms of knowledge. They also understand that history is not and never has been a neutral science. Thus, for myself, in the way that I work with my colleagues and my students, this is engaging particularly in ecological and non-human architectural histories and practices, which comes from the need to continue to develop these as questions and powers that we might take into the future. And as, again, Angelica has indicated, these are, for many of us, not just myself, really engaging quite strongly with questions of difference, of those differences that have been excluded from the practices of institutions and of professions, questions of race, gender, sexuality, and of poverty. But of course, these questions are not new, and these practices are not new. Rachel Carson and Donna Haraway are two of the exemplary practitioners of these kinds of methods. Carson's inspiring fieldwork that used the mythical voice of storytelling to expose the extent to which what we would now call anthropocenic change impacts on the world around us. Haraway's witty and powerful companion species. Each of these are knowingly constructed as part of planetary relations where resources and fragilities are positively and negatively there to constitute our materiality. But both of them are feminists and scientists who practice what you could call critical forms of sympathy. And this is example in Haraway's Modest Witness from 1997, still a text that speaks very powerfully to today, where she argues that we are the children of the techno-scientific revolution of enlightenment, which has certainly given us imaginary emancipation, but has also produced colonialism, racism, and inequality. And together, these produce our contaminated histories. Tacit relations, then, I would suggest, are always already subjective, always material, and always political acts. And as a historical discipline today, if we take it as historical rather than about a dehistoricized project, these are questions which are where architecture has not necessarily responded positively to those communities whose lives are not seen as relevant or powerful to the narratives of modernism or of authorship. And this is something that I'm sure you're very aware is ongoing within many of the institutions of architecture. My institution is itself being asked very strong questions about these issues of exclusion and of rejection of certain communities and individuals. But I want to highlight that if we follow Haraway, there's a potential for this tacit knowledge which comes from listening to these stories and of being changed by them. And here we have a slide which has the work of British Guyanan artist, Frank Bowling. Bowling here has his Middle Passage painting, a painting from '71, but I want to connect it first to the magnificent thinking of Paul Gilroy, British Black critical race practitioner, thinker, who speaks about the roots as in the points of departure and the roots as in the way in which the world is constructed and travel, and argues that there is a special stress that flows with the effort involved in trying to face in at least two ways at once. He speaks of the Black Atlantic, of the diasporic Black communities of West Indies between the European, the North Americas, the Africa continents, to address the historical conjunction, the stereophonic, bilingual or bifocal cultural forms that are originated by, but no longer the exclusive property of Blacks, that are dispersed amongst the structures of feeling, producing, communicating, and remembering. So if we listen to Gilroy, we hear of the need for architecture and its authorial practices to practice inclusion and repair. Again, so that, as per him, Black authors and diminished communities are perceived as agents with intellectual histories and attributes which have previously been denied. And Frank Bowling here, with his middle passage, speaks of the Windrush generation's diasporic crossings between Guyana and post-war Britain. His paintings celebrate race and gender in work, and they celebrate the work of his mother, a powerful shopkeeper and seamstress, who was a core member of her community, a hub of her community. But these relations are also cognizant of the colonial histories of racism, which are still active today and are very present in the UK, particularly in the UK's scandalous treatment of the Windrush communities. So these narratives and aesthetics are here, and they're importantly here because I'm a white British woman, to check the idealism and security of my storytelling from the sites of privilege that I might myself be located with, but also the exclusion of communities from these lives, these architectures. And I believe they're useful because they require us to acknowledge these other knowledges and subjectivities and authorships, which we are going to need and are rightfully in the room and with us today for all the work we must do from here. This relationality is something which Laurent Berlin has called crisis ordinariness. And given today's planetary inequalities, her call for the local, precarious infrastructures in which we construct livability, rather than attempting to create idealized transcendental ideals or abstractions, I think is something which speaks to where we are. On the screen here, we have artist Agnes Dennis's Book of Dust, a long set of writings produced between the 70s and the 80s, which I think amplifies this idea of the poetics of planetary matters and of life. Dennis captures the bodily, the pharmacological, the organic, the toxic, the climatic, and the planetary agency of dust. Her atomic studies of this power of the powers of particles vibrates with material differences that come from the crystal, from the nuclear, the biological to the elemental. And her ecological human and non-human matters compose both material difference as life, but also as death. The artist Tom Corby's practice examines environmental and expressive intersections of bodies, environments, climates, and their data. And his work shown here, work from a project titled Blood and Bones, Metastasizing Culture, produced between 2013 and 2019, which shows the physical and temporal experience of living with cancer and the impact of lengthy treatments during the 6 years of oncology treatment, including a stem cell transplant and extended periods of self-isolation akin to COVID-19 shielding. These artful expressions of living with disease or dis-ease charts his body's affective psychological and physiological data and resonates fresh with our present-day architectural vulnerability and of care in the pandemic, including the daily rise and fall of his immune system and during the treatment, and in relation to the use of dexamethasone, one of the cheap corticosteroids, which is used to treat people with COVID-19 who are on ventilators. Blood and Bones highlights that life is lived in heightened states of biological and individuated time. I think, again, questions and points we could talk about in terms of the pandemic, but it also shows the artist's body as a producer of data or information and records the way in which he is supported by the UK National Health Service, a provision which is both one of scale, but also one between the individual and their local communities and hospitals. And finally, I want to turn to a more planetary, or perhaps climate-based comment for this evening, to suggest that these tacit power relations structure our subjectivities, both in terms of our local authorial relations and experiences, our lived experience, but also our notions of responsibility at larger scales. And I would suggest these are parts of the attunement of authorship that many of us undertaking and having to engage with and think about. Haraway, Moore, Singh, and other thinkers of the Anthropocene and of the Chulucene, that is, stories of the soil, have articulated these relations in vocabularies of non-human companion species. And these signal to both the damaged realities of our contaminated world, but also support structures and other ways of living. And on the slides here, we have 3 images of these kinds of planetary relationships. The artist group Data Manifest Labs Carbon Topologies, which shows the emissions of carbon in air flights, in shipping, and other kind of routes across the globe since the 1870s, of climate change, flooding, and then of the metabolic rifts of organic strata and rock and soil. And I suggest that each of these also point to tacit relations and bodies of knowledge that are connected to our situated selves. These are planetary practices which I think have an accord with what Agnes Dennis calls alien projections, matters of kind in which the world and its matters, its oceans, its bodies, and its ecologies suggest otherwise. These are human and non-human architectural authors, which we are then asked to engage with, to find ways to agree or experience, in order to protect those who are local to us, but also those communities who are vulnerable and cultures and histories that are beyond us. And as such, I think we might call these part of this interrogation and this examination of the tacit in order to produce new vocabularies, new authorship, communities, new practices, which, as I've said, I'm putting under this concept of living with. So I look forward to hearing Christoph's talk and then having conversation with you afterwards. Thank you.
Okay. I hope I can be heard. Does that sound all right? Yes. Well, first of all, of course, thank you very much for this opportunity to do what we've all probably haven't done for quite a long time. I mean, I have to say that I have done lectures in person in a lecture hall, ordinary lecture hall, but a real, let's say, sort of Vortrag on an evening like this has been quite some time. My talk today, I should say, is also the result of shared authorship. Because it's certainly to do with the work I'm doing right now, along with Tom Avamata, Irina Darbidovici, Veronique Pateu, on a new art issue focusing on authorship. So I am not even sure that not some of the sentences I'm going to speak are actually sentences that one of the others have written. They no doubt will tell me afterwards. I'm starting with this image, just as a sort of frontispiece, as it were, of the paths onto the Philopopos and the Acropolis in Athens, and probably everybody knows them. It's a project that is usually attached or associated with the architect Dimitris Pikionis, and it is a work that speaks perhaps of the kind of possibility and the kind of problem of authorship. These paths being laid in the post-war years by something that wasn't exactly a formalized collective. Pavers, professional pavers, students, archaeologists, a huge network of paths
And when you actually try to find drawings of this project, you will never find them. You will, at least I haven't found them, not in any literature. And in a way, I'm also wondering whether this could ever have been drawn in advance. And indeed, whether it would have been possible for the architect to have given precise instructions. Okay, this is better, I guess. This, yes. Sorry about that. You know, for me, walking up these paths on a relatively beautiful spring afternoon, I really thought, you know, how could this have been done? How do you actually communicate your ideas to a rather big group of people where there is a lot of, let's say, coincidence and serendipity even involved in the project, because there are elements from older buildings, rubble from 19th century monuments which had been pulled down in Athens, as well as paving stones. So in a way, you know, this image for me sums up the whole idea. The concept of authorship and its association with a single individual is ingrained in the complex of tacit assumptions about what constitutes a work of art and its production. Perhaps somewhat ironically, it is applied also to architectural works in a discipline of the arts, which are by definition the product of collective endeavors. The specific nature of the process of designing buildings and getting them realized, the realities of an essentially situated form of cultural practice, may perhaps even be an explanation for the persistent emphasis on the individual in whose heroic vision the original idea for the work resides. In other words, because it is so diffuse in architecture, who has certain ideas, or if these ideas are even situated with one person, they're obviously carried further, developed by a larger group. So the way perhaps architecture needs to make that stake of the single authorship even more strongly than, for example, painting, where there is absolutely, often at least, absolutely no question as to who has done the painting, at least as we know painting from the 19th century. I'm obviously not talking about the workshop of Rubens. The need to establish and exert authorial authority in a highly volatile field of power relationships between financiers, officials, builders, and users requires a set of tacit strategies of persuasion, of forging a temporary collective and coercing others to follow it in acts of self-exploitation. That is obviously something that is so unspoken in architecture. We know that we have to follow an idea, we have to identify with the idea, and we kind of forget our self-interest. That is part of the, let's say, social contract of the practice. The question is, however, if in our current circumstances, the concept of individual authorship is not a cul-de-sac, preventing the processes of invention and innovative thinking that would be necessary for addressing a practice that is more collaborative than it has been in the past, and which operates in a culture that professes to question rather than valuing authority. Is there not also a need to conceptualize, regain, and possibly invent alternative notions of authorship, which may be more diffuse, but still no less effective in producing works of art, which I read as significant cultural statements. What would this mean for the modus operandi of those who engage with these creative and social processes? And how might the deep intellectual and emotional ownership that I would argue is a precondition for conceiving and making architecture be retained, framed, and even perhaps intensified in new organizations of labor for this old discipline and for establishing innovative communities of practice? Now, I should perhaps say that this notion of the community of practice for me is an essential notion when we talk about tacit knowledge. What do I mean by that? I think that architecture really always thrives from the network and the conversation between those who are engaged with it, either in practice or, let's say, criticism or theory. And the community of practice for me is that conversation, which is often also situated in a particular city, usefully, but not necessarily only. The question of authorship is also one of formation, and its proof is often in buildings that combine a particular precision in techne and poiesis, both of which are associated with a person who has taken responsibility for both. I think the term responsibility is extremely important here because it's a sort of old-fashioned term, perhaps, but you know, if we question authorship usefully, we would also have to ask who is then taking responsibility. Authorship seems to tend the work of art a distinct aura, not of its physicality, but as a sedimentation of intellectual and creative labor, and, thank you, Hermann Czech, of identification. I identify with that which I have thought. That which I have thought becomes mine, but it also owns me. The author owns the idea of the work, if not the work. But what is implied in this ownership, and it does not necessarily have to be shared with those who must be, does it not necessarily have to be shared with those who must be on board, as clients, as patrons, as representatives of civil society, and probably most critical by those who make contributions in the design team and with the builders. Architecture may be occasionally conceived in the boudoir, but it is not made there, at least if its activities involve building. And as new forms of digital design processes, for example, BIM, are invented, these processes become more rather than less explicit. But even so, as expectations are never made fully transparent, much still remains unsaid, knowing that if it were said, the same expectations might never be fulfilled, as the concerns of all involved are too diverging. In other words, if everybody knew what was coming to them, they might not start on the trajectory. As an architect, you may not tell your client that a particular design decision implies risks, or you may not share with those working with you that a decision implies weeks of overtime. Undisclosed information is probably part of the production process of every significant work of art and architecture. That in itself is tacit knowledge. Not telling everything is part of a resistance strategy against notions of efficiency and economy that would impede many, if not most, significant creative decisions. Also those which actually have a deeper efficiency and economy. How does all of this if I were to change an image now. Yeah, well, I mean, okay. Yeah. How does all of this show itself in the process of authorship and tacitly finding accomplices for realizing the unsolicited? Wie finden wir unsere Komplizen? Let me first look at an example which I've studied for years of the most traditional type. The architect Peter Selsing in his Kulturhus in Stockholm. Now, I actually show Peter Selsing with the 3 men who were essential for this building. And yes, it's all men. This is Selsing above. Pontus Hultén, the director of Moderna Museet in Stockholm in the starting in the late 1950s and the 1960s, leaving for the Centre Pompidou as the first director there. And Hjalmar Mehr, a politician. Selsing was the designer of a building that, in a way, represented the climax of the egalitarian program of the Swedish social democracy. That in itself, and I'm going to, I see Angelica looks at the watch. So I have to summarize here. What I find interesting about Selsing and about this building is that there is, on the one hand, of course, a societal context where this building was probably seen as the, let's say, the apotheosis of egalitarian society, which was going to be realized in this building. Everybody could visit it for free. And it was almost like a built laboratory for the future, say, social democracy. At the same time, it's also the work of somebody who was very, very steeped in what could be seen as tradition. He's often described as the last master of Swedish architecture. So really in that male line of great architects, starting from, let's say, Gunnar Asplund and Lewerentz. Selsing also worked with Lewerentz, of course. And deeply steeped also in the history of Sweden. He also worked for the royal household at some stage. Somebody who didn't express himself in words on the whole. If he did, there's more not said than there is said. Who worked with all sorts of experimental forms of representation. This is a very early model of the building. But also with sketches of the sort that we of course all know, and we do not always know whether they were actually done before or post factum. Of course, that is, we know this is also part of, let's say, architecture, but we know that he made sketches all the time. Now, what's interesting here is that we have this highly embedded practice of somebody who's really within the sort of social fabric of Swedish society, testing, in fact, what architecture can do for this particular highly charged social purpose or social program, and at the same time, making a building that combines, I think brilliantly, although I shouldn't say this, it makes me into a critic, brilliantly a kind of resistance to the major, let's say, opinions about what a building should do. Most buildings at the time were sort of open structures. He was making almost like a city wall. It's an act of cultural resistance at that particular moment. But it's not just a statement, it's also playing a huge repertoire of using industrial standardized projects, standardized objects and elements, using them in a way that is clearly informed by notions of proportion, of, let's say, atmosphere, of rough and non-rough materials. Also of light. Yeah, I mean, it's something where you realize walking through the building, like, for example, when I took this photograph, that, you know, there is not just the understanding of how you organize the material, but also what that material might do to the light, and the kind of, you could say, art piece that is actually constructed from that. And at the same time, also finding a language for, you know, that dream of the modern egalitarian metropolis that was part of this. This is, of course, the period of great, perhaps impossible belief in the future, belief in progress, social progress, often Olaf Palme, among others, and finding a language for that. Now, all of this, if you look at that building closely, you see a large number of elements that you know from other buildings, but you also realize, looking at it more closely, that there is a sort of the eye of somebody who's not just mature, but also extremely cultured, who has a set of references which are used as associations. Now, what is this? How did this office then work? We know that Selsing made his drawings and that he had a staff and of people who were totally devoted, working day and night, telling their partners that no, they couldn't come home. And yes, the weekend was going to be spent working again, as did Selsing. So this sort of culture of self-exploitation. Now, you could say that's also the kind of male camaraderie that's part of it. But you can tell from the building that this was going on. So I'm saying this is sort of the old model, but it also tells us something about the deep commitment of everybody involved, the deep identification of everybody involved. And perhaps it tells us also why, when we question authorship, we also need to take into account whether we actually will not miss this kind of commitment. Now, not to stay with this idealized version of old style authorship, I'd like to switch briefly to, of course, another hero, Lina Bobardi, who belatedly was perhaps discovered, but then recognized and has now been very widely published. I'm not making any points which no one else has made, I should say. Yeah? I'm just putting it here as a sort of separate, as an example of what is also possible, because there are these similarities. I mean, take this building, the Sesqui Pompeia. First of all, Bobardi persuades her client that no, we mustn't take down this factory. We can actually work with it. We're going to save the money for the demolition and do something with this building, which in itself, given also that this is 1977, wasn't, you know, a normal procedure, not even in Europe, certainly not in São Paulo. And then, of course, what this building does is that it works with the existing structures. It uses the largesse of the oversized spaces, which do not have to be constructed. And that means that you can have a library and a canteen and, let's say, a little pond for children to play with boats, all in one hall. That in itself is hugely impressive. But then the question is, of course, how is this sort of thing being conceived, and how collective is this thought process and the process of making? And the suggestion is, of course, there is a lot of collaboration, but it's also clear that Bobardi was a highly trained, highly cultured architect who came from Milan in the who was formed in Milan in the 40s, who had been working with Gio Ponti, who knew the most sophisticated Italian design of that period, who took that spirit into Latin America, into Brazil when she arrived there, and who clearly, from a very authorial statement, a position, did something with his work. And I would suggest that everything we see here relies on that stance. Bobardi carried out a range of smaller conversion projects in Brazil's poor northeastern region involving local residents as future users of the adapted building. But then there is one project, the Teatro Oficina in Sao Paulo, where this process of collaboration was most visibly performed. The Teatro Oficina was clearly developed and executed with a group that had initiated it and was going to use it. By the way, it's using scaffolding technology, so everybody could participate without prior craft knowledge. Now, the question is, of course, did this specific situation provide the conditions for this way of operating? Not everything is openly declared here. Not the preconditions, for example, that allowed Bobardi to forfeit professional charges for work. Bobardi was, so much as clear, a liberated woman, but she was also financially independent and not interested in material gains. But perhaps more importantly, did the context of working with performing artists, and that implies a collaboration between two close artistic and creative practices, perhaps constitute an essential precondition for this diffuse authorship. A diffuse authorship in which tacit forms of communication could be applied, since both architecture and theater share this culture of self-exploitation and are both equally proud of it. Which may take us to contemporary examples questioning single authorship and experiences with co-creation. It is notable that the majority of the project of Construire and Patrick Bouchin also operate in the field of performance arts. Bouchin himself quoted in a conversation we had with Oase with him, Giorgio Strehler, the Milanese theater director and founder of the Teatro Piccolo. And Strehler was talking about the working relationships on the site or in the theater, where every contributor is actively implied in the creative process as an actor, but there is a régisseur. Yes, a director. In the projects of Bouchin and Construire, and by extension other younger practices with a collective organization form, such as Assemble or BC Architects in Brussels, but also in the project for the Spielbuden parts on the Reeperbahn, authorship is part of a process of negotiation, of an Aushandlungsprozess. It becomes problematized, but is nonetheless established in new languages of explicit and tacit communication. By the way, new forms of silence may also be part of this, ideas that can no longer be expressed, but which retain their power, taste, judgments, professional or disciplinary knowledge that remains undisclosed because disclosure would or might be understood to introduce undesired hierarchies. Finally, and most critically, there's an elephant in the room. All these practices, which I explain here, exist because they operate mostly within a sphere in which dominant economical and ideological calculations are suspended. Headquarters for multinationals or luxury hotels in the Emirates are conceived and realized in another way, and the concentration of power and capital is mirrored by tendencies towards more rather than less hierarchization, towards simplified and artificially enhanced authorships. The status of small group of single authors whose intellectual absence is part of their business model is probably more present today than it was in Cinquecento Rome. And I was thinking this when I walked past the scaffolding of the new department store, which is explicitly advertised as the work of a Pritzker Prize winner. Okay, to conclude. Authorship is not only an act that implies originality, it is also a deeply felt commitment and identification to work that until its realization belonged only to the author, but to which he or she is also completely devoted. The reciprocal claim between author and work, which is not only a romantic cliche, but also, I would argue, the condition for transcending one's own limits in further work, can hardly be thought in any other way than through the concept of the author. The question remains, and I think it's an important one, whether there is not also a need, especially in architecture, to give this concept of the individual author other, more diffuse, but therefore no less effective notions of authorship, especially given the collective pressure on the practice. Wouldn't it be more interesting to imagine the concept of the author in architecture as a space of possibility, as a field in which the responsibility, the commitment, even being completely absorbed by the work of invention, is distributed among several heads and hands? Shouldn't there be also, alongside the beautiful image of a flat hierarchy, one that creates space for depth? Thank you.
Mit, dass Leute aus dem, dann später aus dem YouTube werde ich darüber informiert. Also gibst du mir dann ein Signal, ja? Okay. Thank you very much, Peg and Christoph, for this insightful talks and very, very inspiring. And if you probably realize that the talks have some comments, but there are also some differences. So I want to start. I will open the discussion, but again, I just want to mention that, of course, everyone is welcome to ask questions. Also, the audience at YouTube. By the way, I just forgot to say that the YouTube stream will be provided by the ETH Zurich. Tom Abermatte and his group are the project leaders of Tacit Knowledge, so I just wanted to mention that. So thank you both, and maybe because I understood, or if I try to find the common point of your both talks, it's definitely, maybe not only, but there is definitely the topic of practices and the suggestion that there might be new practices or alternative forms of practices in architecture and design, or this question at least arose in you both talks with different ideas maybe. And maybe when I start, Peg, with you, because you addressed this topic at the end, where you talked about new practices and new authorship, concepts of authorship. Do you have any idea, any suggestions how to approach this? Because I just was wondering also, after listening to Christoph's talk, whether is a collective or a collaborative work is not necessarily, to me at least, the direct opposite to authorship, since also a collective work can be even strengthen, for example, tacit assumptions. It's not necessarily that only an individual author is completely in his or her bubble. It could be also a collective or a collaborative process. So actually, therefore, just the first question, do you have any ideas, or could you maybe also, yeah, maybe refer to the examples by Christoph or show others? Maybe just use this screen again as a.
Okay, thanks, Angelica. Thanks, Christoph. So I agree. Yes, we've got this constitution. I think the thing I would highlight is that the idea of collaboration for me is, I mean, it is about multiple voices. And actually, perhaps this is where we differ. I think there's a way in which, for some people, it's about demystifying those specific voices within that collaboration is actually an empowering and transformative element, rather than the idea of a non-disclosure. But I would say your other question really is about what might these be from here. I mean, obviously, I think many people are engaged in this. I'm not trying to suggest that I'm not talking with and alongside colleagues, but I do think that there are ways in which the profession is learning that it's cultures of labor, whilst the endeavor in the sense of self-development or of the self-exploitation in the sense of passion, that the passion work that practitioners do is something that I certainly completely think is part of what an endeavor of artful practice is, of a serious work is. But nevertheless, there are ways in which there are manners in which social, economic and cultural structures do prevent certain individuals from being able to undertake that than others. Now, that's not about diminishing the work of senior colleagues or of producing a TACK. I do think genuinely that the profession needs to address this positively. And I think it's really something that can and should be done. I think it's something that this is a very intelligent profession. I know there's very, very strong constraints on its commercial and its carrying of risk and of its financial precarity, actually, as a profession within the built environment. But I do think that there is that power within the profession to do it. So I don't see it as a difficulty or as something that's impossible. But in terms of practices, there are many younger colleagues who are doing this. You know, many of our younger colleagues are leaving and producing practices which have these kinds of structures very explicitly in place. So I'm in a way, I don't want to name anyone particularly because I'm sure people know of those kinds of practices. So I think it is one where we actually do need to listen. I think some of the more established practices need to actually be more modest and make these changes and show leadership, actually. You know, in the UK, there are some very big practices that don't feel these are communities who have the necessary impact for them to make change. But I think this is the point I'm making about societally, culturally, environmentally. This is happening in other domains, and I think it's something which is happening and can become more distributed, could become more impactful. Not to produce new homogeneity, but I think it's something that actually would create more resilience in the profession in some ways.
Maybe extend maybe just to because to maybe to put it on the one hand more generally, more abstractly, so in order to not to talk about a very specific practice, but nevertheless, because you also now mentioned the passion, or what Christoph called the deep commitment with the practice, or what you're doing as an architect or a designer. But on the other hand, if you want to be aware of about this relational situation, or this embedded or situated knowledge in which we are embedded all together, you also need a kind of an extremely and high self-critical awareness in order to become yeah, actually, yeah, almost in like a Kantian situation where you completely have to ask yourself where I am, where are the others, where how do I look at it, how do I practice, and so on. So how does this relate to this at the maybe it's only at first glance dichotomy between the deep commitment or this passion. When you, on the one hand, you want to be an intellectual or want to be completely self-critical. On the other hand, there is this, yeah, practice of just doing it. Could you just maybe answer to this more abstract question?
So I'm my interest in situated practice is not to return back to the idea of individuated sort of self-reflection. It's not about solipsism. It's about recognizing how our concept of authorial contribution is one that produces the capacity, this corporeal sense of reasoning rather than just a scientific reasoning that can allow us then to connect with others. So there's empathy. I mean, it is about relationships. And I think this is where, you know, the feminist writers and thinkers are drawing attention to that we are not autonomous beings. We are always relational. You know, this notion of, you know, autonomous, modernist, rational thinking, the legality of it. I mean, this is why Spinoza is really interesting. He's prior to those institutions of 18th century rational, logical, autonomous individuation. He is at a time when all the kind of concepts of social bonds, of forms of individuation are still actually for him very divine. I mean, this is part of his project. It has a concept of the divine that connects the human individual to social, to environmental, to urban, political, cultural form. So I'm really, at root, the reason that I think the projects of people like Haraway and Singh are so valuable is that they remove this idea of the single individuated, autonomous individual. They really are about the fact that that concept of self is actually really problematic on many fronts, but it's also actually, in a way, it's not reality. So that's how I would respond. So it's not about this solipsistic return to the individual. It's actually about that produces the connection to a much more social form of action and agency and of contribution and of generosity.
So maybe just then actually this decommitment of this authorship as you did understand it or did introduce it is then more or less illusion.
Well, first of all, it can't be an illusion because it produces works of art.
Yeah, it might also come from this elusive position.
Well, I mean, that, no, I mean, obviously, you could say that this is based on judgments on particular buildings, which you recognize as being truly extraordinary in their quality, and that in itself seems to me to be proof of something. Yeah. No, I'm just thinking of what Peg has just said, and when you were talking, I of course had to think of Fernand Pouillon's novel Les Pierres Savantes. Yeah. Where in a way there's something that was your description reminded me of that, because there's that sort of concept of the group of workers, of which the narrator is part, but also in a separate position. Yeah, but I mean, it is clear that the authorship, let's say the responsibility for the work is actually shared by everyone, and to some degree, and this perhaps also relates to your point about the sort of the non-human aspect, because I mean, obviously, in the narration, les pierres are also part of the actors. Yeah, he speaks extensively about how the work is actually made by what is already there, because the stones have this particular quality and they actually have a character. Now, in a way, I think that is also an interesting and I think a valuable image for how buildings can come into existence. But of course, it's not, let's say, the Aushandlungsraum, the space of negotiation, because, you know, there's part of that is also the religious purpose, which is so big, is so defining, that somehow all the individuals sort of, you know, become subordinate to that, including the narrator, who is, in our terms, the architect. And I don't think that, although I think the novel is really a beautiful novel, I read it with great pleasure, and I think, but of course, this is not how we as human beings, you know, formed by 200 years of, what is it, individuation, if you like, are going to work. So obviously, there is a lot of space between these different concepts. You know, that was, perhaps I should also claim, or I should also make clear that I was interested in the space of possibility, not necessarily saying, well, you know, this idea of authorship is the ideal model. But I would also like to make the point that, you know, you need aspects of this type of authorship if you want something that is really specific, because otherwise you get offices like, well, now I'm going to call the name, Vita Architecture, for example, in Sweden, which is this, you know, they probably have 1,500 employees. All their work is great. No, sorry, all the work is good in a way, in the same way that IKEA and furniture is. Yeah. And then, of course, the question is, I would argue we are losing something here. Not simply because it's perhaps not as poetic as it should be, but also because that kind of practice doesn't necessarily sort of provide solutions that nobody had thought before. You know, and I think that is, for me, the balance. I wouldn't like to make this into a conversation about work-life balance, because, you know, as an architect, your work is your life. If you don't believe that, then you should do something else. Yeah, no, I mean, seriously, because this is not a profession where you can make that distinction. You still have a very beautiful life. No, not still. Then you have a very beautiful life. But I think we should also resist this kind of fashionable, I think, let's say, discourse about, you know, the distinction. Having done that, how can we derive pleasure from this life, which is also work? Because we are entitled to pleasure as human beings. And that is where I think the space of possibility is. And it helps us, I think, to look at moments of conviction, not to emulate it, even if we are not going to be like medieval monks, nor are we, I mean, I'm not for a moment suggesting that we should be slaves in a big architectural office. You know, it's much more interesting to see the space of negotiation, almost in the sense of Hannah Arendt, yeah, but also realizing, and now I'm going back to Arendt as well, who makes that distinction between work and labor, that we are engaged in work, that we we think something that is so much part of not just the moment, but actually much longer. I'm not talking about eternity here, but really about, you know, the identification gives us a huge amount of, yeah, enrichment and pleasure. Sorry, this is becoming very moralistic.
Yeah. But before it becomes too beautiful, I just wanted to just to add or to ask. Yeah. The bread and butter question is actually what about power relations, which of course an office might still provide a situation where you maybe can at least have this illusion. I come back to this idea that the bad reality is outside. They are the power relation, but nevertheless, these power relations, the the society we live in and the economy we live in, the politics we live in is also part of your office or part of your work. And even, yeah, and maybe you should also, because you have now addressed it as if it was still this kind of enrichment of your life because you're creative the whole day. What makes this life so beautiful?
I mean, of course, as somebody who teaches, also I know I have to mark exams. I've got to give marks, and that's not a beautiful part of my work. No, of course, there's a sense of purpose that kind of carries you through certain aspects of your life, of your work that you perhaps do not like so much. But perhaps that's not the main point. And I agree about your point about the power relationships in an office, yeah, and I think that is exactly why somebody like Lina Bobardi becomes such an interesting figure, because there's clearly a sort of different model, and I would suggest that even somebody like Selsing, perhaps it's because it's almost the pre-modernity of his office, perhaps also has more of that than you would find in today's practice. And in that sense, it may be interesting to look at the medieval chantier, yeah? Not to emulate it, but to also have a sense of social memory of what work can be. Not to stay there and not to go back to the Selsing office. And that's also why I made the point about Bobardi being in an exceptional situation, but perhaps we need to see in those instances what can be used in the current circumstances.
Beck, you could just interrupt with the live.
Should we open it up to people, because you've got questions?
I don't know, are there any, okay, that's, I just wanted to repeat, just to be sure that the YouTube audience really did understand. So everyone is welcome to ask questions, but since I'm not, I have no screen of I do not see the audience in YouTube, so please, put your questions into the chat and then I will be informed by that. But when I may continue now, if there's no other question, David, do you want to? Oh yeah, of course, please. Yeah. Sorry. Ooh.
safety are really questions where, you know, I think there's a lot of Black writers and thinkers and practitioners who are asking Western cultural communities to really address the fact that there have been histories of slavery, which have consigned individuals, large communities, large groups of people to non-life. So I think that's why I've placed it in, but I understand your point about Singh and Harry. They're asking for a transformation of what constitutes concepts of life. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
There's one technical situation. I need to change batteries, but you
Okay.
can still continue talking over the computer.
Okay.
Yeah, well, thank you for the point about authorship and responsibility. I think perhaps it's a matter of words, but I mean, I think for me, the association of responsibility with notions of authorship, and I was, of course, trying to make the point that it's not about the single authorship, but actually keeping the sense of authorship as a sense of responsibility and as a sense of identification is perhaps what I was trying to do. Not so much, I mean, this was not perhaps it wasn't so clear, or I didn't make myself clear. It wasn't necessarily a song of praise for single authorship at all. I mean, I was actually questioning it. Whether that is attached to somebody who's male, female, or non-binary, or whatever other self-definitions or auto-constructions we're talking, is perhaps another matter, although I do recognize, of course, architecture is dominated by male heterosexual men, by white heterosexual men, and has been for a long time, unlike other creative practices. So something is going on here. But that is changing. That is clearly changing, and that will also change, presumably, the kind of negotiating processes of authorship or of, you know, how things are being conceived. Now, how does that include the non-human? I think that's a very interesting question. I can't at the moment, I haven't got a conception of how it might be part of the, I haven't got a idea of how that becomes part of the act of conceiving, you know, as a sort of conscious conceiving. So the only image I can at the moment muster, and I mean that may be my limitation, but that's also because I'm an architect, is that notion of cohabitation. In other words, we live in one world with a series of, a whole range of creatures, and rather than destroying their livelihood, we might actually include, their needs in what we build. You know, that would also mean that perhaps we don't do Wärmedämmverbundsystem because we actually need some spaces where the swallows can live. As to how to deal with questions of that Peg has raised about, let's say, inequality and let's say deep cultural biases. To some degree, I would still suggest there is one aspect of responsibility which we have as, let's say, citizens of a state or human beings, and one other, or much more precise, as architects. And I think it is necessary to make that conceptual or categorical decision. Sounds, of course, terribly tyrannical, but I think we are talking about different categories of being involved in the world. When I as a citizen or as a human being engage with something, I have a series of opportunities of action which are broader. Whereas as an architect, I think I have a set of very specific, let's say, vehicles and possibilities which are specifically to do with architecture. And I think it makes sense to make that distinction.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, Aristide wants to ask something.
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to ask Christoph something about. Yes, I would like to ask something about your concluding remark, Christoph. This idea of distributed authorship that could drive to some kind of depth. And I would like to have some more words about this. I think also maybe there is something that is very related to your discourse that I don't understand well. How will we make the distinction between this kind of distributed authorship and an elaborated way of making history about architecture? I think that, yes, also making narratives, as you also did, needs always a kind of naming process. And there is a setting of names that organizes narratives. We are used to this type of narratives, at least. And for instance, you began with Dimitris Pikionis' street path in Acropolis. And we know that Dimitris Pikionis was also referring sometimes to Hassan Fatih, who is this architect that chose a different role for himself. And I think also choosing a role of one's own as an architect is also an important statement for the work that one decides to do. So Hassan Fatih has done this work in Gurma, the Gurma project that we remember that he educated people to make plinths that were peasants, they had nothing to do with it, and build and then build their own houses. So somehow he is an architect and he's an author in this kind of process. Pikionis, when he started to build this street, he has his own history. He had a brilliant student, Konstantinos Doxiadis. And Konstantinos Doxiadis did this PhD about how things are positioned in Acropolis. And he thought, and he proved it, but it was proved wrong, that there was a polar setting, so that the ancient Greeks did a kind of axis making, similar to the Renaissance. And so that they were choosing points and doing kind of tracing of axis. And then Pikionis believed this and did his pathway by bringing students of architecture, choosing himself the correct points and creating this type of axis of this polar vision that was the wrong theory of Doxiadis. So all this has a kind of, it's a story that includes different actors that are architects with their own points of view. So maybe after this, yes, you can tell me something.
First of all, thank you. I also have to say that, I mean, you obviously know much more about the path than I do. Yeah, I mean, I've taken the photograph, I've been there, I've read about it, but you know clearly more than I do. So thank you for that. What I was thinking while you were talking is, of course, Fatih, who's really also, I think, one of the undervalued architects, or sort of somebody I'm personally becoming very interested in. Because it is this idea of enabling rather than you know, making other people do your thing. Yeah, and I think that is also part of a sort of, it is a kind of authorship. And we go back to what Bouchard was talking about, Giorgio Strehler, where Strehler says, "Well, I am looking at people, I talk to them, and I see there is something in that person that perhaps the person isn't even aware of, but can be, as it were, not so much extracted, but it's something that the person can develop in a conversation between, in this case, the régisseur and the actor. And what I would suggest is that there's probably sort of much larger range of, let's say, working relationships, personal relationships in making something than simply the sort of single top-down authorship. And in a way, it would be good if we kind of found alternatives to the, let's say, the liberal profession model and the, you know, where you actually run an office and that can also go bankrupt and whatever. It would be good if we had the opening, the much more this space of possibility I was talking about. So yes, I think that, you know, that was why I was interested in this sort of what I sense in the work of Piccionis without admittedly knowing very much. I mean, I was using the image to structure my own thought, but I think the enabling of each other is becoming a very important part of this. And that, of course, will also, it will also in a society where clearly gender relationships are totally different from what they were 50 years ago, or 30 years, or 10 years ago. Of course, that will also change the process of negotiation, because we are constructed completely differently, or people are constructed completely differently from what they were 25 years ago, also in that aspect.
Maybe I, sorry. Thank you, Aristide, because what I like in this story, that there's a narrative which is based on wrong assumptions, or assumed wrong.
The wrong views are
Yeah. But maybe I could take this to take over also to PEC, because I just also was wondering, because when you use the term narrative and creating a false knowledge, so to say, which becomes a narrative or a story which was taken over by others, and by doing that they started to produce or create an architectural design. Tacit knowledge, or this idea of tacit knowledge, and you once mentioned it that I think it what you said, that it's not telling everything. It's very often about, or we discussed it implicitly as this what is always hidden, or what is not on the foreground. But on the other hand, as I did understand tacit knowledge, it's not hidden, it's just visible. When I take this famous example of using a bicycle, it's still there, it's visible, it's obvious, but it's not so easy to talk about. However, to make it short, I was wondering whether this idea of a narrative, maybe not as the kind of the via regia, the all method, might become, even if the narrative is wrong, this might be something like an alternative step to come to different processes of producing architecture. So not about the practice itself, but also about finding ways of also a new architecture. But it's not only about the process, it's only about the output. So I just wanted to hand you over to say something like a final words about your approach also to architecture itself, or a new architecture.
Thanks, Angelica. So I think the point about narrative, and actually this is where there's a difference, I think, again, of elements between Christoph and I, that a narrative, or this idea of tacit knowledge not being just determined by representational status and representational knowledge, is where the narrative comes in. Narrative has this temporality, but the narratives that I was particularly referring to in a way are those of the mythical voice. David mentioned this, but this is where they are the futurial, they are from the past and they're of the present, but they're also outside. They also take this tone, which is not universal. It is a multiple temporality. And I think this is something that actually is, again, very present. I mean, the pandemic, you know, how many times people live within a pandemic experience. But there's also, I think, a point about that, which I guess I wanted to just respond just very briefly a bit to Christoph's sense of the categorical error of a citizenship set of values versus the architects. And I suppose I find that, I mean, we're not going to finish the conversation tonight, clearly, but I have to say, I find that problematic. And I think this is where the notion of narrative is really important as a way of preventing those categorical either or concepts of work and production and practice, because I also think they're really problematic for architects exceptionalizing themselves out of practices that are actually planetary. And I would use the example of our scientists and other kinds of practitioners who are able to keep those practices together with their passion, with their life work. I think there are some really important scientists who do this, and they are clearly at work a lot. So I find that sort of problematic. So I have to say, I know I've slightly swerved into that comment that Christoph's made, but I would say that's the point of narrative. I think it also doesn't produce the same ideas of non-disclosures or of exclusions. I think it does. It is both, and I'm sure, Christoph, you'll want to come back.
Yeah, well, I mean,
Okay, so then now you have the final word.
yeah, well, I mean, why should that be? Well, I mean, I certainly wasn't using the word categorical in a Kantian sense, or, you know, it really is about, perhaps the word isn't right because you're misunderstanding it. I was simply talking about, you know, what kind of, what are the instruments to conduct your vita activa. And we all have instruments which we have as human beings and as citizens. And as architects, we have very specific instruments. And they are to do, of course, with, yeah, let's say, a whole range of, let's say, bits of knowledge, insights, which they're not exclusively ours, but they are clearly to do with a very specific expertise or specific knowledge. And that was my difference, nothing else. It's not about categorical errors. I mean, I wouldn't dare of talking about that. You are the philosopher. I'm just, you know, simple architect. But you know, the narrative, of course, it's interesting, and it's also the narrative which doesn't necessarily think of authority, or if the authority is there, then it is sometimes also, let's say, perhaps of a different sort. I'm always thinking of, I mean, my two heroes are Gramsci and Pasolini, and perhaps go to Pasolini, and there you see there's a narrative, but there's not necessarily a position of power. And or as much as there is a position of power, it's entirely from that sense that, you know, basically you can just do what you want because there's nobody who's going to prevent you from doing it. And I think that is, if that model of the authorial, to me, seems actually quite a productive one. And that also means that you can then work with Maria Callas and get her to play Medea and do something that she didn't know she could do, perhaps. And, you know, I mean, so there is vulnerability in authorship, in that kind of authorship. And if you then connect it to, let's say, the kind of commitment that comes out of Gramsci's idea of the organic intellectual, and there's the materialism, I guess, but in a Marxist sense, not in a, yeah, then I think that those are also part of that story. So perhaps that kind of nuances my stance here.
Okay, there is just David. Could you? It's yeah, very, very brief. Yes, sorry, it's already 9 o'clock.
Thank you. I couldn't resist, given my learned Greek colleagues, Aristide's comment, where we immediately shift from the Euclidean misconception of the Acropolis to the relational geometry of a Pythagorean understanding, which is truer, which returns us actually to Pegg's early work and relational geometries. I don't want to use the word relational aesthetics because a certain director of the Tate uses it in a rather different way, but I think it's actually rather more appropriate, and in turn takes us back to your assertion of Spinoza, who Spinoza, in addressing the ethical rather than the moral, and that there is no concept of singular truth, which references Spinoza's own heritage of 5,000 years of Jewish intellectual thought, where it only takes one scholar for an argument, because you can always argue with God. There is no absolute.
Take this as the last. Or is there? I don't want to cut. Okay, Hermann Schächer.
I like the word responsibility, this notion. And obviously we are talking about whether this responsibility can be split and how. I don't think it can be split in the way that is occurring in the recent decades, where a total asset of a building or of an enterprise or whatever, resulting in something like a building, is coming from an investor. And then this investor employs consultants. And one consultant is the architect who helps him make the building looking successful. I understand responsibility by the circumstance that at least when I was under education and so, the architect was asked, why did you do this and that? The consultant answer would not, the consultant's answer would not be to answer with a conclusive reasoning of his decisions. Instead of answering the question why, he or she would say why not, and yeah, I don't think this is a way we can keep the notion of responsibility. I have three approaches to the question of authorship. Very often an aim of my designs, or a part of the aim of a design, is that the result should not be something extraordinary or something special, something striking, but rather, at least in parts, it should look like nothing. And even for that result, it is necessary to keep up a responsibility. For example, Joseph Frank said, look, make our environment as if it had resulted by chance. Now, if you, this is not achieved by restricting your conclusive thinking. It's not achieved by just waiting what comes out. On the contrary, there are very often result effects that seem to be intentions, and nobody in fact thought about that. On the other hand, I'm grown up with teamwork. I have been one of the scholars of pupils of Konrad Wachsmann. Konrad Wachsmann has had a large influence on Austrian architecture, on very different personalities, in fact. And he had a very precise scheme of a pedagogic scheme that resulted in the almost making authorship anonymous. And if a team in that sense works well, we talked at noon about that, if it works well, then every participant thinks everything is by him, because he identifies with the whole. And at the same time, there must be the discipline that this question is not, does not arise, so that you say everything is by everyone. This is the second approach. A third approach is that I have been also influenced or taken part in the idea of participation. In the 70s, participation had the theoretical background that the architect withdraws with his decisions and leaves the expression to the users. When you keep up this idea of participation several years, you are either stupid or lying, because it is not possible to withdraw that way. I have rather thought that participation is one element where other people bring something into your design, users or whatever people, and you have to deal with these things. And what is brought in by other people can be absurd or wrong in your opinion, or not being usable for later people, for others, or whatever. So this dealing with this sometimes contradicting ideas is painful. It's not an easy job. But still, even in that respect, you cannot just give up and well, let it be. Yeah? You still are responsible. So the problem is, how can this responsibility be distributed to several people? I have no answer. I don't know whether this is an obsolete standpoint. Maybe the answer of to answer the question, why did you that, is a male white old answer. I don't know. Maybe the modern answer is why not.
I think I agree. I mean, because if the answer were, or if the question were to be replaced by why not, I think that would be too unverbindlich, too, there's too little commitment. And I think, yes, but I've been arguing for responsibility myself now. Of course, I think the connection between the two seems to me to be absolutely essential. Now, the examples you're giving, Wachsmann versus participation, they're all in the repertoire in a way, yeah? I mean, there is the professional culture which binds people together, but they also believe in a specific form of, let's say, approach or even solution. But you also know that isn't going to answer every question, because, it's there are certain questions which cannot be answered by that. The other about the participation, I would agree. I mean, there's obviously, it's not simply giving everybody what they were thinking, or there is a chorus also needs somebody who actually draws something out of the different voices. And I do not think there is necessarily an easy answer to this, other than an awareness that this is clearly part of what has to be designed as much as the building itself. Perhaps that's too open, but I think, it's obviously something that then also becomes part of your responsibility. Let's say that designing the enabling, while at the same time also making sure that the outcome then really has something to say. Because also, Josef Frank, yes, of course I fully, I mean, Frank and Czech and sorry, Frank and Selsing, obviously, Frank and Selsing, yeah, of course also, there's a lot of Frank and Peter Selsing as well, yeah. Yeah. This is such a big question again at the very end that I think there's probably another hour of conversation in this one.
Should we keep it open for the moment because it's also quite late? It's also quite late, so I just wanted to suggest to keep it open because it's still what Christoph said. It's quite it's an issue.
Yeah, but it's an existential issue. It's what I've been trying to say. How to deal with a responsibility, but also.
Yeah. For example, Herr Czech, maybe you could explain. I saw your design for the Sigmund Freud Museum, where 3 offices actually, or 3 architectural design teams, were creating together what you call the nothing, or it looked as if it was done by chance, but nevertheless, it seems that it was a kind of endeavor to do this kind of nothing with 3 offices all together. So maybe the next time you might explain to us how you did it. Would be interesting, because maybe this is a kind of an alternative model of practicing. This might be an alternative model of practicing. So unfortunately, we could not, of course, we cannot go through all aspects of this broad issue. Therefore, I want to thank you, everybody who has joined us here in the lecture hall, in the real space, and on YouTube. And of course, many, many thanks to Peg and Christoph for being here and giving their talks and insights. It was fantastic to have you here. And yeah, the next lecture will be on May the 9th. Then we will have Margita Buchert, Gennaro Postiglione, and Gaia Caramellino. The Gaia and Gennaro from Milan, and Margita will come from Hanover, so we hope so, depending on all this pandemic situation, so I don't make any promises. Thank you very much, and see you next time on May the 9th. Thank you.